Okay, Chair, we're now live on YouTube. When you're ready, would you like to start the meeting?
Thanks very much, Wendy. So good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to East Devon District Council's virtual Strategic Planning Committee meeting on Tuesday, the 3rd of May, 2022. I'm your Chair, Councillor Dan Ledger. Based on the decisions of Council to continue virtual meetings until the 11th of May 2022, I'd like to remind both members and the public attending or watching that this Council has delegated much of its decision-taking powers to our senior officers. We'll continue to adhere as closely as possible to the procedural rules detailed in our Constitution, but in the event of a break in the internet connection, please bear with us as we try to reconnect. After 15 minutes, if we are unable to reconnect, we'll consider the meeting adjourned and reconvened at a later date. If you wish to comment, please raise your electronic hand and wait to be called. Any members of the public can view the agenda by visiting our website, eastdevon.gov.uk. We'll now start the meeting by doing a roll call of all committee members here present, and it's over to you, Wendy, to do the roll call. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll start with yourself, Councillor Ledger.
Present, thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair, Councillor Davey.
Present, thank you.
Councillor Allen. Councillor Arnott.
Present, thank you.
Councillor Bailey.
Present, but I'm sorry I have to leave at 2:30. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Blakey.
Present.
Councillor Chamberlain. Councillor Hayward.
Present, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Howe.
Present.
Councillor Ingham. Councillor Moulding.
Present.
Councillor Pratt.
Present, thank you.
Councillor Rylance.
I'm here, and I think Sarah sent apologies. I'm not sure. I'll just double check
Thank
that.
you. And Councillor Skinner.
Yes, and apologies for Councillor Benningham. He's away on holiday, so I know that. He asked me to tender his apologies. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, back to you, Chair. We are quorate for this afternoon's meeting.
Thanks for that, Wendy. Really appreciate it. So the first item on the agenda is public speaking, but as I understand it, there's no members of the public wishing to speak. So we'll move on. Thanks, Wendy. We'll move on to the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 5th of April. If anyone has any comments, please raise your electronic hand. If I see no hands raised, I'll take those as approved by the committee. So we'll take those as a true record. Thank you, everyone. Moving on to agenda item 3, which is apologies. Again, over to you, Wendy.
I've just received, apart from the apologies we've received during the roll call, I've also received Councillor Lawrence's apologies as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Moving on to declarations of interest. So again, I need to remind members, can you please, when you're stating any declarations, we need to know the agenda item that you're declaring it for, what type of interest it is, whether it's a personal or a DPI, and why you're declaring that interest. So I'll hand over to Wendy again to do a roll call.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start with you?
Just agenda item 8. So I was a member of the HELAR panel.
Thank you. Councillor Davey?
I think agenda item 8, I am an Exmouth town councillor, and there is a site in Exmouth that is assessed in there. So thank you.
Could I just ask, is that personal or is any
it
other?
Is no,
Yeah,
it's just personal, Shirley.
Thank you. If members could just mention that as well, please.
Councillor Arnott?
Yes, agenda item 8 also a personal interest as a Colleton Parish Councillor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bailey?
Just a standing declaration that I have a personal interest as Devon County Councillor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Blakey?
None, thanks, Wendy.
Thank you. Councillor Hayward?
Yes, if I may, a personal interest in item 8, as I too was a member of the HELAR panel, and a further personal declaration, if I may, for items 7 and 8, as I am the clerk to All Saints Parish Council, Chardstock Parish Council, and Axminster Town Council. Thank you very much, Steve. All those are personal interests. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you. Councillor Howe.
Yeah, personal interest as a member of Bishop's Cliff Parish Council.
Is that for item?
Who
8?
knows, Wendy? So
Oh,
all
right.
of them, you know.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Moulding.
None.
Thank you. Councillor Pratt.
None to my knowledge, Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rylance.
Personal interest in item 8 as a Broadcliff Parish Councillor. Wendy, thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Skinner.
My usuals, please. I'm going to declare an interest as with FWS Carter and Sons, Stewart Partners, and I do have a piece of land, of my own land. So those two are personal interests. This piece of land is a pecuniary interest, if indeed it comes up later. So I'm covering more bases before we start. And if anything else comes up, I'll deal with it as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks very much. So the 5th item on the agenda is matters of urgency. So I can confirm that there are no matters of urgency to discuss today. We move on to the confidential and exempt items. Again, I can confirm that there are no confidential or exempt items. So we move into the main agenda, and the agenda item is the housing need and site assessment update. And it's over to Ed Freeman to present a report. Good afternoon, Ed. Welcome to the meeting, and over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members. So this first report, as the title suggests, made up 2 key elements. The first element of the report is to advise members of a change to the Council's housing need figure as calculated under the government standard method. So members will be aware that we had been working to a figure of 918 homes per year. However, updated figures have been published for the affordability ratio, which is one of the key inputs into the standard method calculator. This gives us the ratio of house prices to earnings in the district, which has risen from 10.08 in 2020 to 10.88 in 2021, meaning that house prices in the district have risen more quickly than earnings, such that housing is now less affordable than it was. Under the standard method, the higher the ratio, the more the housing need figure is pushed up, and so the housing need figure rises as a result of this change to 946 homes per year. This means that over the next 20-year period, and taking into account a 10% supply flexibility, it's considered that we now need to plan for a further 608 homes, giving a total of 18,968 homes as the housing need for the planned period. These figures will be confirmed in the upcoming revised local housing needs assessment, which we're looking to bring to members in early summer, but we thought it was useful for members to be aware of this change as soon as possible. Members will also be aware that Council debated the standard method for calculating housing need at its meeting in February, and the Chair wrote to Michael Gove MP on members' concerns. That letter and the response received are appended to the report for information. The letter does not, however, change officers' view that there is no viable alternative to planning for meeting the need identified by the standard method. Just turning to the second element of the report, which is really how we move forward with that work. The second element relates to officers' full and detailed assessment of each of the sites put forward in the call for sites and assessed by the HELAR report. While the other report on this agenda provides part 1 of that report, this is only part of the assessment work that is being undertaken. So the HELAR report only considers sites against the HELAR methodology and looks at issues such as what sites are available, suitable and achievable in the district. In this respect, it's only part of the assessment of sites. Officers are currently undertaking more detailed site assessment work to determine how well sites put forward achieve the Council's policies, aims and objectives as identified in the Council plan, and through the previous discussions through this committee over the working draft of the local plan. This work also needs to consider how well sites fit into the spatial strategy and ensure that it is fit for purpose and meets members' aspirations. The timetable for doing all of this, such that members' views on sites can feed into the draft local plan, which it is intended to consult on in the autumn, means that it's proposed to bring detailed site assessments to members in stages. The intention is to bring assessments of sites in and around the main towns in the early summer to get members' initial views on these sites. This would then be followed by the remaining sites at the end of the summer. Given members' resolution at your meeting on the 28th of February to set aside more time for presentations from developers and site promoters, it's also proposed to set aside time to enable them to present on the sites in and around the main towns, alongside officers' assessments being made available. The intention would be that officers' assessment be published, followed by 2 day-long meetings of presentations in advance of a committee meeting to actually debate the sites, with the benefits of both officers' assessments and having heard all of the presentations from site developers and promoters. In the event that members are content with this approach, members' views are also sought on the issues of the length of time to be given to slots for presentation and the prioritisation of sites. These issues are highlighted in paragraphs 3.4 and 3.5 of the report, and are issues members will be aware of from previous discussions on how to accommodate these presentations. It's suggested, based on the experience we had last time, that it may be appropriate to provide only shorter time slots to smaller sites. So that there's a proportionate amount of time to the scale of the site, I suppose, and also the report raises the issue of prioritisation in the event that the time set aside is insufficient to accommodate all of those wishing to present. So just turning to the recommendations themselves, see that there's 4 recommendations for this report. The first is to consider the update to the local housing need figure and its implications as detailed in the report. 2 is to recommend that detailed site assessment work for sites being promoted for allocation in and around the main towns be brought to the committee for consideration in the early summer. Recommendation 3 recommends that arrangements be made for 2 further day-long virtual sessions for presentations from site promoters and developers of sites in and around the main towns, this to be held before members formally consider the site assessment work. And finally, in the event that recommendations 2 and 3 are agreed, members are asked to consider the issues of the length of presentation slots and the prioritisation of sites, as detailed in paragraphs 3.4 and 3.5 of the report, and recommend an approach for the meeting arrangements. Thank you, Chair.
Very much for that, Ed. We'll start outside of committee. So, Councillor Young, you're up first, please.
Thank you, Chair. Affordability ratio. It doesn't seem to be working. It's gone up from another 38, is it? But this idea that put more housing in and it will reduce the house prices doesn't seem to be working at all. Can you tell me how many houses are added to our figure for this affordable housing? As you say, it's gone up, but has it? What's the original figure and percentage increase? And is there any area in the country that, with these sort of affordable housing ratios, has it worked that the house prices have actually gone down? Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. It's detailed under 1.2 of the report, so it goes up from 918 to 946 homes per annum. So work out your quick maths on what the difference is there. I think it's an extremely blunt tool. I don't think it's worked. I don't think it works anywhere across the country. I think we live in a beautiful area and there is a huge demand for housing down here. And just because we start building more, you're just going to get more migration, really. It doesn't work. And we can write to the government as many times as we want. We need the government to change the standard methodology if we want to make real inroads and we want to change the way that we strategically plan across the district. Is not strategic at the moment because all we're having to do is lead by numbers, which, yeah, it's not really enjoyable, is it? Councillor Bailey, understanding what the time is, I'll come back to people outside of the committee. I'll come to you next, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, yes, I completely agree with the comment that you've made. The letter is, I would say, disingenuous because it tries to say that it's within our control as a council, but we well know that actually it's not, and that what we risk doing is, if we deviate from the standard methodology, running up hundreds of thousands of pounds of costs. And then having a local plan that isn't found sound. So yeah, so I wasn't impressed. But there is one part of that letter that I do agree with, and that's about brownfield sites. And I really, really think, and I know I might sound like a stuck record because I always say this every meeting, but they specifically say in the letter that the NPPF gives local authorities should give substantial weight to the value of using brownfield land within settlements for homes. They should support housing development on underutilised land by, for instance, converting space above shops and buildings on or above service yards, car parks, lockups and railway infrastructure. So I feel, and I'm just referring now to the chart that's in the next agenda item, which is at something like 6.4. And what that shows to me is that in our call for sites, and I know we've done another call for sites at the moment, but that shows me that what we're risking doing is placing far too much burden on our villages. Because if you look across the parishes and look at the towns, that is way disproportionately weighted to our villages. So something like 80% of those 31,000 houses is in our villages and around our villages, and only 20% around the towns. And I know that what you might say is, well, of course, all those houses aren't going to come forward. And yes, I accept that that's the case because we're only looking for 18,000. But what this shows to me is that so far there's too much emphasis on the villages and the lovely green fields which landowners might like to have developed, and not enough emphasis on the towns and not enough emphasis within the towns. And, you know, we need to have more than 6,000 out of 30,000 coming forward from our towns. And I think having all the emphasis on our villages, which don't have the jobs, services and facilities, isn't in accordance with the NPPF. And I don't really understand why we haven't done any work around a strategic urban capacity study. The urban capacity study that we've done was on about vacant land, but I'm thinking about the land that we own that within the towns that could be used to help us meet our target. And I think that's absolutely essential. And what I'm thinking is a strategic a survey, so that then we can get our numbers in the towns up, so that then we're not spreading out into all around our villages and destroying the countryside. And I think that would be better from an environmental point of view and from a planning point of view, because our services, jobs and facilities are mainly in our towns. And I think as well, those 6,300 sites or houses, that have come forward in the towns, they're probably at the perimeters anyway. So we need to be looking at in the centre of our towns to actually try and develop there, rather than just, where the landowners all around the countryside think that they'd like to have a housing estate. So I really hope that if I put forward a proposal that we commission a piece of work from LDA or equivalent, a high-level strategic brownfield site urban capacity study, not looking at the sites that haven't been built on, but particularly focusing on land that the district council owns, that we could actually accommodate more houses within the towns and put less pressure on our countryside and biodiversity. Thank you.
Very much, Councillor Bailey. Point really well made. And I think if you look at what the meeting today, just with the Queen's Drive Delivery Group and the work of Jerry Mills bringing forward, that is looking at our brownfield sites amongst the Exmouth area and how we can better utilise them. The issue is, if you look across the district, well, there's a number of issues. It's actually getting the owners of these sites to come forward and put forward the permission so that they go through the HELAR process. But the work, the sites that are available in our ownership, there is a work that Tim Child's team will be bringing forward across the district for potential opportunities. I think the main issue that you've got with a lot of our towns is that the centres particularly come under conservation areas. So they will be difficult. If we are looking further and wider, and that's the work that Tim's going to be doing over the next couple of months, I think we're going to make some serious inroads in that area.
Sorry, can I just come back? Because what I'm thinking about is our car parks. You know, what about our car parks? What about our centre, our assets in the centre of towns? And it's great that Tim Childs is doing that work, but this is a rolling process. We're going to run out of time. We need to get that work started. We need to get it commissioned. We need to get it brought forward, because otherwise it's going to be too late. And the guest process did it for LDA, did it for guest. And I know that Ed Freeman was going to come back with some information following either our last meeting or our previous meeting, and I think that we can't let it slip. We need to do that work as part of this process, aside from whatever Tim Childs always been done, is doing for his process and for Exmouth. And I think it's really important for our local plan process. We need to be able to demonstrate that we've actually actively, for this process, assessed at a high level our strategic sites. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Tim's definitely aware of the timelines and the need for getting these sites in for the call for sites deadline on, is it the 14th or the 15th of May? They're well aware of it, and he's working to that. So we will be receiving the sites as soon as that work's completed. If I go back outside of committee, and we'll come to Bruce Sarum next, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've listened very intently to the debate, and I take the opportunity to refresh members from the letter which I've received, which all of you received, from Andrew Roberts, who represents the North East Exmouth residents groups. And I know we were all copied into this. And I just wanted to raise, given the fact that Ed has told us we've got 918 to 946 houses, I wonder how we will overcome objections in the early summer, because the letter says the figure of an additional 455 dwellings cannot be supported by the town's existing infrastructure, particularly in respect of primary and secondary school places, health facilities, public transport links. And I hope that the HELA process in the early summer will take these factors into account, because clearly I heard Councillor Bailey saying there's been far too much emphasis placed on the villages and burdens in the villages. But I think from what I can see from this North East Exmouth group, we've got similar issues arising there. So I think we have to think very carefully as to where we put available housing so that it fits into our infrastructure and generates benefits for everyone in the long term. So that's really what I wanted to say. And thank you so much indeed, Chair.
Very much, that Bruce, really appreciated. I'll go to Councillor Faithful next, and then we'll bring in Ed just to cover off all the questions already made. So Councillor Faithful, we come to you next, please.
Thank you, Chair. First, going back to Councillor Jung's comments about affordability, we need to work more ensuring that we're securing a higher proportion of affordable housing, because we all know that every opportunity, developers will whack that number down as much as possible. And that's what we really need in our community, is all this arguing about so many houses will drop the market price. It doesn't do it down here. It's easy enough to find that houses all around us that above £1 million. So, and people are easily willing to pay that sort of price to buy up down here. On the other subject is all this going for brownfield sites. I'm afraid we're losing employment land in our town centres, and it's happening time and time again. And I don't want to mention any names, and I won't, but have to listen to some councillors 1 minute at these meetings arguing, defending employment, and then you go to the planning meetings and they're giving permission for change of use from employment to, it's like we really need to be much more secure on our employment sites, because we're losing them so many times, and people are struggling to find the spaces to set up new business. I mean, everything's changing all the time, and people are always starting something fresh and new, but you're just losing the spaces because they all go for housing. Anyway, thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much for that, Councillor Faithful. Ed, can I bring you back into the meeting now, please, and just to cover off anything else that I haven't and everyone else's questions, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chair. Yes, if I just go back to the housing figures, I mean, I think as you said, Chair, the standard method's quite a blunt instrument. I mean, fundamentally, it's trying to apply basic supply and demand principles in that if prices are escalating such that housing is becoming less affordable, then you supply more. But I think what it doesn't take account of is that it's far more complicated than that. It's not a simple supply and demand equation. There are many other factors that are leading to housing becoming less affordable. That's where the standard method just doesn't address those other issues that I think we're probably all aware of. In terms of the HELAR addressing, sort of identifying a disproportionate number of sites in the villages, well, I mean, that's the result of the call for sites and the sites that have been put forward. Fundamentally, the HELAR is a process of sort of doing that initial assessment of the sites that have been put forward. But as has been identified, we have done an urban capacity study which identifies some land around the towns, within the towns and brownfield sites. And one of the things we need to do in terms of the further work to be done on the HELAR is to identify those other sources of sites and go back through the urban capacity study, identify those sites and bring those through the process for further assessment, as well as the Chair said, I've had discussions with colleagues about putting forward some of the council's land assets through the current call for sites, and I've been very clear with colleagues that really it should be about putting sites forward so that they're in the process so that we can consider them. Ultimately, through the local plan process, it will be for members to consider whether or not it's appropriate to allocate them. But if they're not in the process, we can't even consider them. So therefore, things like car parks, which have potential, should come into that process so that we can do that work and we can assess them formally through the process and come to a view on those. So I hope that we will receive a fair number of submissions of council land through this current call for sites that will enable us to do that and take that forward. In terms of the Exeter City Council work that Councillor Bailey referred to, I have looked into that. My understanding is that fundamentally those sites were identified through the urban capacity study work that was done through GESP. What they got LDA to do was sort of have a look at the large strategic sites that they'd identified in Exeter, to look at what potential they had and how they might sort of come forward, what capacity they had, and how that could feed into their strategy, which would sort of be the next stage of work if we were to identify a significant number of larger brownfield sites within East Devon. I should point out, obviously, that Exeter has much more of a sort of industrial heritage, shall we say, and much more potential, I would say, in terms of large brownfield sites coming forward. But certainly I would say that at this stage, I think we've got enough information to identify those brownfield sites and do that assessment work. And then if we do identify significant sites that have potential, then certainly we could look at doing a similar piece of work to Exeter to see how those might come forward and what potential they have. But I think we need to see what we end up with, sort of with the final HELAR, as it were, in terms of brownfield sites through the second call for sites and additional work I've referred to off the back of the urban capacity study. Another work we'll look to do in terms of seeing exactly what brownfield sites we have. But certainly, I agree with the philosophy of a brownfield first and making maximum use of the sites we have got that are previously developed land within our urban areas. That's a key principle of the government's planning policy, and we need to make sure that we've exhausted those options. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much for that, Ed. Really appreciate it. We'll continue outside of committee and we'll go to Councillor Chapman, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not sure where to come in with this. It is directly for you. North of the Goodmoors Farm site in Exmouth, there are two sites put forward. They have come forward before, but there were a lot of reports from Natural England. I think there were about 4 or 5 reports. Now, reading through on the information on these sites coming forward, the planning officer said that they were refused because they were not required at the time. They were actually thrown out because of the reports that were brought forward. I see they've been brought forward again. So I would like to ensure that you and your committee actually see the reports that came forward on those sites, rather than waste committee time looking at a site that has been turned down because it was deemed unfit to be developed. And I don't know how many other sites perhaps in the area that have been perhaps turned down for similar reasons, but the landowners have brought them back forward again. And whether Ed could give you all the work that has been done on these sites, and therefore you can rule them out rather than waste the committee time. So I don't know if you've seen them, Chairman, but I would like Ed to bring them forward for you, especially to have a look at. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much for that, Councillor Chapman. Yeah, happy to receive any information on sites that are coming forward. Obviously, today's not going to be the day that we discuss individual sites, but please do share any additional information that you have on particular sites with the committee. I'm sure Ed will be passing on as much information on each site as possible.
Yeah. All the work done by Natural England and the other associations was sent through to EDDC, so Ed should already have them. Thank you, Chair.
Perfect. Thanks very much. So we'll move into committee now, and we start with Councillor Skinner. Over to you.
Thank you, and I very much want to pick up on what the things have been said, and it's clear to me. I do agree with you, Chair, that and I'm sure other members, Councillor Young as well, that just by increasing numbers means that if we get an oversupply of housing in some way, the houses are going to drop. I think it's a bit of a nonsense, to be honest with you. I don't know that I agree with that. I think that is just flying in the wind. I think the things that are going to change, I think housing prices are going to change, but it's got nothing to do with the capacity of house builders building houses. It's going to do with the increase in mortgages. It's going to do with the increase in the cost of living, and it's going to do with wages not keeping up with those two costs that are coming on, and energy costs as well. So I think where we're going to see a real squeeze on people, and where we could end up into a bad place where we don't want to be, is those are the real factors of people being able to afford. And it's really disappointing, actually, that here we are trying to play our part in our way as far as opening up land to try to maintain our housing figures and numbers. And what's happened out of all of this is they've now pushed the housing numbers up as if we weren't in a bit of a quandary before. Now it's made that position even worse. And I feel the foot on the back of our necks is the loss of the 5-year housing land supply. And that is the real issue, that then development takes place where we don't want to see it strategically planned to. And that's my real issue. A second point, I think I want to pick up on Councillor Bailey's points and comments that she made. And I actually wholeheartedly agree with Councillor Bailey's views on many issues about villages grow. And what we would deem to be, and I think she was alluding to, an overextension of a higher proportion of numbers growing within the villages, unproportionate to the size and scale of those villages in coming forward, and that alluding to the towns taking more pressure. Of course, this is the pressure between us as members, those of us that live in the countryside and represent rural areas, and those that represent towns and the pressure they got. And Councillor Brewster Sarum spoke a little bit earlier, and I'm sure Exmouth members, certainly on this forum and others as well, would agree that Exmouth is coming under tremendous pressure, and whether that infrastructure is going to work for that tremendous pressure is something that we're really going to struggle with. So I think really where I'm sort of landing, and I know Councillor Bailey was suggesting about the pressure on greenfield sites against the pressure of brownfield sites. And Councillor Faithful pulled up on the point of, are we losing brownfield sites of employment land? And we need this balance. And there's a balance between employment land that is, shall we call it, unused employment land, and land that has a future in either being more employment land in its change of purpose, or being changed into something else entirely, which is housing. And I think what I will agree with Councillor Bailey, I'm going to support Councillor Bailey on, is having some dedicated format that gives us the ability to have oversight of, and I lay this through you, Chair, through to Ed, some oversight of the employment space that could be opened up for housing, and for us to have a feel of that and see what that is, because that's really quite fundamentally important about how we take the next steps and whether or not we go for greenfield space. So what we have to do is if we're going to have more housing and we haven't got enough land, this isn't rocket science. We're going to have to build on greenfield space. It's not rocket science, it's simple. But what we want to know is that and I think if our Councillor Bailey would allow me, if I'm wrong, I'm sure she'll say, but gives us the opportunity to see where we can make the best use of lands that are within the towns to keep the towns also vibrant and keep the towns the ability to develop brownfield space in towns for an affordable packages is much easier than trying to afford them in the villages on greenfield sites is my preferred view. So I do like to support. I want to support much of what, not all of what Councillor Bailey, you would know I don't support everything that you say, but much of what you've said makes absolute common sense. And I think what you're asking for is more information for us to have more knowledge to be able to make the decisions just a little bit further down the road. And that I very much support and agree with. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Skinner. I see that very much the work of Tim Child, what he brings through, and we'll see when we get the renewed HELAR report coming through of all the sites across the district in our ownership, as well as, and I forgot to mention earlier, the work of Joe Garthert with the new housing task force. And we will see, obviously, housing sites coming forward in our towns and centres on areas of land that we currently own or we could potentially own in the future. So that's another area that we'll be bringing forward as well.
Just to finish off, if you don't mind, Chair, did Ed say, just so I'm clear, the points that Councillor Bailey made and then Ed responded, and just to Ed, just to be clear, did you say we're going to look at doing that work? Because if you are, we're done here and that's fine. Did you mention that, or is Councillor Bailey going to make a proposal that the work gets done, and then of which I would be quite happy to second? So I just need to know through you, Chair, which way this is going, so as I'm clear about what decisions we're making.
I'm saying that Tim Child's got that work in train at the moment, and they're submitting sites. Well, they've submitted sites from this morning for Exmouth, but they'll be submitting more sites across the district in the next couple of weeks.
So that's underway. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pratt, we'll come to you next, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was encouraged to hear Ed speak about progress being made in regard to the work hopefully now being done by the council. The council play a big part in this local plan in more ways than one, and they are a landowner. They have property which they can use for housing, and they must play their part. And we've mentioned this before in other meetings, and I'm hoping now that this will move forward, and we'll hear from Tim later in the next meeting or so. The next thing I would like to talk about, because it does affect housing, and that is green wedges. It was mentioned in the minutes of the last meeting, but I think we need to review green wedges again. In Ottery St Mary, there is land which has been recommended by the planning officers for development of 200 houses. 200 houses to be built on a green wedge. Now that cannot happen. That really is wrong. If we're going to through neighbourhood plans, appoint land which is going to be used as a green wedge, then it must stay a green wedge and not be used for development. I think we must get that right. I understand there are issues in Seaton, which the chair will mention if I'm saying this wrong, but I think there is land down there which there's a potential development going on onto some green wedges down there. But that's another point. We do need to talk about the rules relating to green wedges, and if we can get that on the agenda for the next meeting, that would be helpful. There are plenty of little sites which you could call brownfield sites, where you can build houses in the towns next to where all the shops are. You need to have the properties, the dwellings built near to the shops and other places where you have services on hand. So that's more important than having these developments proposed on greenfield sites. So I think if we can work on this and stick to the principles which really are set out in that minister's letter on behalf of Michael Gove, that letter set out in terms of what we should be looking at. And hopefully now the council are onto that system of looking at alternative sites for housing. There's one other case I wanted to mention, again, going back to Seaton. There are 3 sites down there, all were proposed to be for employment. I think about 16 employment units in total. And I have suggested that one of those sites could be used for housing. And I know that the council have had a survey done, and that is sort of agreed with what I was saying, that one of the sites could be used for housing as opposed to employment. There's got to be a balance between employment and housing, which Councillor Skinner mentioned just now. So hopefully that will happen. So I think it'll work out about 6 houses and 12 units instead of 12 employment units instead of 16. So there's scope for development along the lines of sharing land for employment and housing. So I think that's enough for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Councillor Pratt. Just on green wedges, that is something that we highlighted in our policy and tenant in a previous meeting, and there will be obviously information coming back in regard to green wedges across the district once we receive the draft plan. I think Ed will shout if I'm wrong at any point with that. With regards to the Seaton sites that you mentioned, they will be getting discussed as part of the levelling up bid, the proposed Axe Valley bid that's coming forward. Again, Tim Child and Alison Hayward. Tim Child seems to be really busy at the moment with multiple things that we're throwing at him, but that will be coming forward through that. So again, that would be something that we can discuss that will obviously we'll be linking into strategic planning committee as well.
Yes, I have written actually to Tim and Alison on that, to one about the one of the sites there to be used for housing as opposed to employment.
Okay, thanks very much.
I think I did copy you in too.
Yeah, thank you. Ed, do you have anything else you wish to add at this point?
No.
Thank you, Chair. Well, just a couple of things. One was to say that obviously we need to be careful about this balance between employment and housing, because obviously a lot of the sites being referred to are obviously either currently vacant or potential employment sites, and making sure that we don't develop all of the opportunities that for employment to come forward in our towns for housing purposes is something we need to be careful of, because obviously providing employment within the towns is key to ensuring that the towns are self-contained and minimising out commuting, which I know was one of the council's aspirations, I think, that's referred to in the council plan as something we wanted to achieve through this local plan. So while I agree with trying to bring full brownfield sites, we need to be careful that we get the balance right and that it's not housing at the expense of employment and employment that's needed within those towns. So that's where we need to be careful in relation to this, and where further investigation and work is needed. As you said, Chair, further work is going on in terms of green wedges. We certainly won't be able to bring that to the next meeting, but we'll bring that when that's available. The other thing to say in terms of brownfield sites, I suppose, is to not lose sight of the fact that we do get quite a high number of windfall sites coming forward. each year. Often a couple of thousand homes a year come forward as windfall sites that are often on brownfield sites, but it's often quite hard at the plan making stage to know where those sites might come forward, because we're talking about a 20-year plan period. We don't know necessarily what sites might be vacated in that time or suddenly become redundant during that time period. So it can be quite difficult to predict brownfield sites coming forward, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that they will come forward, and we can comfortably predict that they will come forward at a reasonable rate during the plan period, and that is all factored into our housing numbers that predict a good number of brownfield sites coming forward during the plan period, to take account of at least a couple of thousand homes within the plan period. So that will happen probably as a matter of course, and is factored into our thinking. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ed. Really appreciated. Councillor Arnott, we'll come to you next, please.
Thank you, Chair, very much. And in fact, I fear Councillor Bailey's now had to leave. So I was going to just lightly touch on a couple of the things she said. I'll just say it anyway. And you've very helpfully clarified this, Chair, as has Mr. Freeman. So my understanding of what this council wants to do at the moment, this administration wants to do, is indeed to look at the land, we might describe it as brownfield, owned by ourselves as an urgent priority. And that is the work that will come forward from Tim Child and Joe Garfoot. And I'd like to see that coming forward as fast as possible. Councillor Bailey mentioned our car parks, and I've always felt that that has huge potential, and that indeed, as a district authority that wishes to show a lead on how to do this kind of thing, we should be looking at the most innovative forms of construction there as well. But I'm sure that will come forward over the next few months. In my view, Chair, it must. It absolutely must, because we must start building this stuff soon. One of the reasons for needing to build it soon is not only the huge, almost tragic level of demand for local younger people in particular, but also older people, for any form of housing in East Devon at the moment. But it's also, if we can do this, we can then go to that affordability ratio matter. In other words, if we can start supplying more low-cost housing, more social housing, then that will be a virtuous circle affecting that. What worries me, though, Chair, is, and I hope it's just a load of old nonsense before the local elections, but there is the Prime Minister flagging wanting to resurrect, regenerate, dig out of the ground the right to buy policy, which just gives us every type of problem if we do start trying to build our own stuff. So that's a thought. I think the other thing to say, in agreement with Councillor Bailey, was that the Secretary of State, or the letter sent on his behalf, was slippery, wasn't it, really? All it said was, well, you know, boys and girls, you don't have to build where you don't want to, but you'll have to build it in the next district to you. Well, I mean, that's not any kind of action plan, is it at all? So it looks like at the moment we are stuck with these new numbers. I don't think we should panic about them, because, as everybody has said, it's over a 20-year period, and there are plenty of ways in which circumstances will change. I agree absolutely with everybody who said we mustn't encourage viable brownfield sites where there could be economic activity to be plucked off and brought forward too fast. I think that could be counterproductive, but I do think that we can take a completely opposite policy with our own land, and we should be looking to try and bring that forward ASAP. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much, Councillor Arnott. Councillor Howe, we'll come to you now, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was on a toss-up between this one or the next agenda item, but being as this is about the site assessment particularly, and then we're going into the site assessment next, I'm very concerned about sewage, my favourite topic, because nowhere, particularly on the next agenda item, when you look at the individual sites and the assessments that are being made, a number in the West End said they're available readily now for the next 5 years. And I can categorically sit and tell you here today, because I had an email from South West Water only a week or two ago, where they haven't got a clue what they're going to do to fix the sewage problems they've got in our villages. In fact, they've resurrected, they're going to try again something they tried 5 years ago and failed, which is basically welding manhole covers shut to stop the sewage outflow coming up. So until South West Water is part of the site assessment and a reasonable timescale is put in for South West Water to fix the problems they have in our current villages and communities and towns, because Lympstone and Exmouth as well are involved in this, then these site assessments on the next agenda item in particular are woefully wrong and need to be pushed back 5 years plus on a number of them. But again, we haven't got a categorical map to say which communities are involved with which sewage pipe and all the rest of it, which again, we need to sort out with South West Water. Apart from that, everything else that's been said before is absolutely spot on. I've got no problem with a thing that's been said before, and we're doing the right things, which is good to hear. I'll even give Mr. Councillor Arnott a bit of praise there. He's pulled his finger out and managed to get the right people in almost the right places doing. We'll wait and see the results, mind you, Councillor Arnott, but at least we're trying to do the right thing. And, it's the same with employment. Yes, we've got to protect employment spaces, and Mr. Freeman is dead right. But a lot of these employment spaces these days are mixed. So you have a shop on the ground floor, offices for the next 2 floors, and then you have housing above and everything else. And that makes more of a community because it's all together in a very tight time frame and very close together. So we need to be imaginative, as Councillor Arnott has said. We need to be positive. But overall, I've got to come back to my favourite or worst subject, which is sewage has to be part of this, because we cannot carry on allocating land and allowing it to be built before we have the sewage infrastructure, to stop pouring sewage into people's homes. So that has to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Howe. I'll bring in Ed in a minute to speak on communications with South West Water and plans for the future, especially with the local plan. But first we'll come to Councillor Davey. So over to you, Councillor Davey, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Councillor Howe. You keep banging on about sewage because it is really an issue. And I also thank Councillor Bailey. I know she's left, but I thank her for raising this subject. And I totally agree with what everybody said about the blunt instrument of the affordability ratio. It's a mystery to me how anybody can afford a home that is 10 times average salaries. How on earth does anybody do it? When I moved to Exmouth, my first home was about 3 times my salary, and I would think mine was probably about average. So it's just a mystery to me how anybody affords it at all, but they obviously manage. I kind of slightly take issue with the idea that we're lumping all the growth into villages, because I think we'd already agreed that most villages were going to only see modest growth. In any case, I think some growth in villages has got to be essential for their survival. I would hate to see our villages become fossilized to the point where they're just not viable anymore. If you get more people in them, there's more support for shops, for pubs, for the school, and possibly for public transport, which I think is going to be key in the future to the survivability of our villages. So I'm not too concerned about growth in villages. I'm more concerned actually about growth around the edges of towns, because it's fine in my own town in Exmouth to say Exmouth is a sustainable location, but if you cite the growth so far from the town centre that it's actually further away from it than many villages, then it's not sustainable. Goodmore's Farm, which we're just seeing developed now, is a good example. There's no way those people are not going to drive into Exmouth town centre, or more likely not even bother with the town centre and just head straight for Exeter. So I think we do need to look at that again and consider whether growth around the edges of towns is actually siting it in a sustainable location, unless it's done the right way. If it's done the right way, that's fine. And I felt Goodmore's Farm was a missed opportunity. We could have had a really good sustainable transport corridor from Goodmore's farm. We could have had, I know there's some employment land going in there, but we could also have considered, the availability of nearby shops and so on. So I did feel it was a missed opportunity. And I absolutely agree, develop brownfield land first, but there isn't an awful lot of it in Exmouth. What you get is little pockets of housing. I think the Pankhurst site was probably the last one to be developed, and gradually everything that was brownfield in Exmouth has been developed. The docks area, the old Pankhurst works, and as Councillor Faithful pointed out, a lot of that is loss of employment land. And as Ed has said, we need to be careful about using up employment land for housing. We've seen some loss of employment land already with the Redgates development, which is going to be yet another old people's home. And I'm not against those, but putting a few little industrial units in to say, well, we've addressed the employment issue, doesn't really address the loss of that land. So I think there's an awful lot of issues that we need to bear in mind here, and not least the question of sewage. So we'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Councillor Davey. Councillor Skinner, will come to you. Are you
very
Skinner?
Yeah, very, very quickly. And I just want to pick up on the point what Councillor Davey was saying, because my points that I was making regarding the villages is I am all for the growth of villages, Councillor Davey, and I think I think many others are. But it was the scale, and I think where Councillor Bailey was coming from was looking at the scale of waste some of these villages are going to grow, and that's not something that we want to see. We want to see the protection of villages. They need to keep their hearts and their souls about who they are, what they are. And if you had a little village like mine for Talton, for example, if Talton had something like 70 houses put into it, it'd be catastrophic for Talton, because we're only a tiny little village. We might have half a dozen, we might have 20 over 20 years, but we're not doing 60, 70, 80 houses. Too many. That's the only point we're making. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Skinner. Councillor Arnott, over to you.
Very quick one, Chair. I just wonder if I could, through you, invite Mr. Freeman, just almost for the sake of the public record, really, just to absolutely clarify and confirm what this process is, and that this is not a process that is in any way giving pre-advice, pre-outline, full application planning permission. Do you see what I mean? I think that'd be really helpful, because we understand that, because we've read this stuff over and over again for the last few years. But I just wonder if they could clarify that might be helpful.
If it's possible, I will take that in the next agenda item, just so that we can keep it as we'll cover it on that. So we'll just cover off this one. Ed, can I just bring you back in just to cover off everything, and then I'll move the recommendations from the chair.
Thank you, Chair. I think the additional item to pick up on is the one Councillor Howes made with regard to sewage issues and water quality. I can perhaps provide him with some reassurance in that we're in the process of commissioning what's called a water cycle study as part of the evidence base for the local plan. So this would be consultants looking at issues of the impact of growth on water quality and the marine environment. And one of the outcomes of that study would be for the consultants to advise us on the need for any planned or new enhanced wastewater and water supply infrastructure, and also to advise us on any phasing issues in terms of how we phase growth and development to enable that infrastructure to be delivered and provided. So that will give us some independent insight, I suppose, from consultants into those issues, and some advice to help to inform conversations with South West Water, I suppose, but also some expertise representing the council to help to take those conversations forward, I suppose. So hopefully that's a positive way of helping to address those issues and ensure we have adequate and independent evidence to support production of the local plan. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. So I'll just move all of the recommendations from the chair as listed in the reports. Councillor Howe, I see you want to come back. Keep it to 30 seconds, please.
I will, and I'm not picking on Mr. Freeman, but it's just for clarity. Great work, but what you mentioned was about the future, whereas a lot of the communities are suffering now with a substandard infrastructure already with South West Water. So bear that in mind when that consultant looks at it. It's what's inadequate now and how do we get that up to standard. Thank you as well.
Thank you, Councillor Howe. I think we need to do some more lobbying on South West Water. So, Mrs. Shaw, can you take us to a vote, please?
Yeah, just before we go to the vote, I hate to interrupt you, but recommendation 4 mentions discussion and length of presentations for the 2 days that the developers are going to make presentations. I don't know whether members wish to indicate outside of this or whether you wish to continue to discuss that element of the recommendation.
I don't think we really discussed it. I think 15 minutes seemed a little long at the last time that when we had the all-day sessions. So possibly reduce that down to 10 minutes. And I'll open it up to the group and what they believe. Councillor Howe.
Thank you. I mean, I was actually in favour of 3.5 because I thought some of the larger developments needed the 15 minutes, but some of the smaller ones, or all of the smaller ones, certainly didn't. So I actually 3.5, I thought for Mr. Freeman was a happy compromise of making it shorter on the smaller ones and keeping the big ones a bit more open to allow us to have that in-depth question and answer session and everything else we need on the larger ones that, let's face it, have a much bigger impact on everybody. But, you know, that's my view.
Yeah, more than happy with that. Councillor Skinner.
I'm going to go with that, and well done, Mike, and mention it. And I was going to pull up on it actually, because if you remember, Chair, we got to the point with the small ones where we gained so much time. We was here twiddling our thumbs, and I had to do a bit of singing. And I tell you, my voice won't go to all this singing every time we do these things.
You're a great whistler, Phil.
Yeah, I know. So I think I'm going with Mike, and if that is if Mike wants to propose or whatever, you want to do that and go with how Ed has laid it out. And I think Ed gets the gist of it anyway, and he understands that. I'm going along with that. Yes, please. Thank you.
Perfect. I think we've come to a consensus there, Mr. Shaw. So if you take us to a vote, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, members, you've got the recommendations in front of you, including the recommendation in relation to the shorter presentations for the smaller areas and the slightly longer presentations for those that are the rest. Please, would you indicate whether you're in support of those recommendations by pressing your green tick if you're against, press your red cross, or raise your electronic hand if you wish to abstain from voting.
Those watching online, the vote is currently underway. So currently we have 7 votes in support, no votes against, and no abstentions.
That's carried. Thank you very much. So we move on to the next agenda item, which is the East Devon Housing and Economic Land Availability Assessment, and it's an interim report. Firstly, just apologies that some of the items came in late, the appendices for this. As you can see by the agenda, all of this information is for noting. It's for utilising a later committee meeting. So I just thought it would be useful that we had this as soon as possible, and that's why it's on the agenda today. So it's over to Ed Freeman to present his report. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose of this report is really to draw members' attention to some of the headline findings of the HELAR so far. Noting that this is only part 1 of the report. A further call for sites is currently taking place, which will lead to further site assessment and HELAR panel meetings. It's intended to provide the assessment of these sites and additional elements of work, such as the combining of the housing and employment delivery trajectories in a part 2 document, which we should be able to present to you in late summer, early autumn. As has previously been discussed, the HELAR is not the definitive assessment of sites. It is a technical evidence document that seeks to identify sites and broad locations with potential for housing and economic development. It seeks to assess their development potential, their availability, and their achievability. Further assessment work is ongoing to assess which sites should be recommended for allocation in the new local plan, taking into account the HELAR findings, but also other factors, including how well sites will achieve members' policy aspirations, as previously discussed by the committee and identified in the council plan. We also need to do further assessment to look at how these together will lead to a suitable spatial strategy to go into the new local plan. And it's once we've done that additional work that we'll be coming back to members and asking members to consider the individual sites. As the chair has said, at the moment, the assessment is simply for members to note. The report before you seeks to give insight into the HELAR process and site assessment work, as well as some of the challenges that this work has presented. The headlines of the HELAR work so far are really that 682 sites have been identified and assessed so far, including those submitted in the 2021 call for sites, as well as those submitted in 2017. 25 sites did not pass the stage A assessment, so this would be because they either fall entirely within a flood zone 3 or in a protected habitat or other insurmountable constraint, as detailed in paragraph 4.26 of Appendix 1. The remaining sites were then assessed in terms of their availability, suitability and achievability. And you'll see the report states at table 1 that 288 sites were confirmed to be available. Apologies, but that figure is in error. It should read 331, which the eagle-eyed among you will note that makes the next table make sense because it's then a lower figure than the overall. So apologies for that. So that figure then also rises to 420 if you take into account the sites that were submitted in 2017, but have not yet been confirmed as being available for inclusion. So ultimately we have 420 available sites that we've considered through this process, which gives us a potential capacity of between 36,000 and 40,000 homes on available sites across the district. As I say, then those 420 have been assessed in terms of their suitability, which takes into account various questions as detailed in paragraph 6.7 of Appendix 1. So this is things like, are they in a reasonable range of services and facilities within an acceptable walking distance? Will the site have an unacceptable impact on biodiversity or heritage? Those sorts of clear constraints to those sites. So 339 sites were found to be suitable under that criteria, excluding those within the Cranbrook Pan. That then leaves 336 sites with an approximate capacity of around 31,000 homes. The report then seeks to break that down by capacity by parish, which is there for members' information to see how how that works out spread across the district. So as I say, identification of these sites simply means that they have potential for housing or employment development according to the HELAR. It does not in any way imply that planning permission would be granted for their development or that they should be allocated. More detailed assessment work is ongoing to consider their potential for allocation. And for this reason, members are simply asked to note the results of the interim HELAR report at this time. Members are also asked to note that a further report will be presented in late summer, early autumn with part 2 of the report. And this will include any further identified sites, which by then will have been assessed against the methodology being considered through the HELAR panel, effectively been through the same process that the sites in part 1 have. And then the final recommendation before you ask members to note that the appended part 1 report will be combined with that part 2 report, and together they will form a key technical evidence document to support production of the new local plan. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ed. And just while I've still got it, can we just cover off Councillor Arnott's questions that he asked in the previous agenda item, please?
Yes, certainly, Chair. So, yes, I mean, in terms of the process, I mean, there's quite a detailed breakdown in Appendix 1 of the process, but as I said, fundamentally is about whether or not sites are available, suitable in terms of a high-level assessment against clear constraints such as heritage assets, flood zones, those sorts of issues, and what's achievable on those sites. That is quite distinct from the kind of assessment that we now go on to do, which will then determine whether or not they're suitable for allocation or whether or not planning permission should be granted for them. So nothing in the HELAR report suggests that we should be granting planning permission or allocating these sites. That's part of the further work that officers are currently doing, that, as detailed in the previous report, we'll be bringing forward to you in terms of the main towns in the early summer and the remaining settlements towards the end of the summer. So yes, I would hope that no one would read too much into the HELA findings. That they are based on a limited methodology and don't necessarily mean that those sites will be allocated. It's effectively a pool of sites for us to take forward through further assessment work to then decide which of them should be allocated. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much for that, Ed. Really appreciated. Councillor Rickson, we come to you, please.
Well, I apologise if I'm raising this in the wrong part of the agenda, but I would just like to say that maybe something that should have been raised in the last item was the fact that there is significant growth in this country in hybrid working, with a lot of people choosing no longer to commute 5 days a week into an office. But do we, with housing developments, have the right combination, right permutation in terms of the houses? For example, do they have sufficient space for people to have a home office? Do they actually have access to reliable broadband? And I think if we could actually solve this conundrum, then the provision of live-work units with home office could reduce the need for commuting and would help us to meet our climate objectives, whether this is based in villages or in towns.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rickson. I think that really comes down to, we've already previously spoken about it on quality design of our homes, and design, it comes into the layouts as well, and how we take that forward. And I think we have discussed it quite at length at the policy intent stage that we've previously done at previous meetings, and that is something that will obviously feature as the plan develops, and we'll hopefully be seeing some actually meat on the bone when we receive the full policies when we see the draft plan. So that will be coming later on, I'll assure you. I don't see any further hands up, so if everyone's just happy just to note the report, I don't think we need to take a vote on that, Mrs. Shaw, do we? Just happy if we're just noting?
I'm happy if you to just note, unless anybody wishes to put a hand up that they would prefer we didn't. No, there's no other hands.
I think we're happy. So
happy to note.
We'll take that as noted. So with that, I think that brings our meeting to an end. So I'd like to thank everyone, including the members of the public, for their attendance. I'm going to remind members that until the Democratic Services team have confirmed the live streaming has stopped, you can still be seen and heard. So thank you very much.